Perhaps one of the most significant events in U.S. history took place way back in March of 1840. It ignited 30 years of brutal, unrelenting guerrilla warfare in America's southeast, and the subsequent effect on the national psyche lies somewhere immeasurable and astronomical. It is a tale of desperation, hope, greed, and revenge, all steeped in the incomprehensible man-made horrors of the Old West. This is the story of the Great Comanche Raid. In early 1840, times were tough for the tribe of Native Americans known as the Comanche. Several years of war with their rival Apache, as well as a catastrophic outbreak of smallpox, had severely weakened the numerous Comanche war bands. Another year of fighting might see their people wiped from the earth, so instead, they sued for peace. 3 Comanche emissaries rode out to the newly Texan city of San Antonio to meet with city officials, and were told that if the Comanche returned a dozen Anglo-American captives unharmed, then peace would be forthcoming. The emissaries agreed to return with captives in just over 3 weeks, but it was a promise they couldn't keep. Throughout their history, the Comanche were never a single, unified people. Despite being united by language, there were at least 12 different subdivisions of the tribe operating almost entirely independent of one another, as well as up to 35 independent war bands with shifting loyalties to the larger groups. On top of that, the Comanche differed from their fellow Native Americans in that there was no official power structure within their war bands. If a young Comanche warrior was skilled and charismatic enough, he could defy the wishes of his tribal elders, then lead a raid against just about whoever the hell he wanted. And the Comanche were prolific raiders. The word Comanche is taken from a Ute word meaning "he who attacks me all the time," and it was through this culture of war and raiding that they acquired so many prisoners in the first place. Yet their division presented the peace emissaries with a huge problem, because the Anglo-American captives were spread out among the different groups and war bands, convincing each to give them up proved impossible. Relinquishing a captive meant losing a valuable source of slave labor, meaning their captives wanted ample compensation in exchange for their release. In the end, the emissaries were only able to negotiate the release of a single American prisoner within the allotted time frame. On March 19th, the day of the Texans' deadline, a Comanche delegation of 12 chiefs and 53 warriors returned to San Antonio. They had come dressed for the occasion. Some wore long braids woven with coyote fur and decorated with brightly colored feathers. Others wore huge, buffalo horn headdresses with their faces painted a garish sanguine red. It made for a magnificent sight, but it was one the residents of San Antonio found terrifyingly intimidating. When the Comanche met with Texan officials, one of the warriors dismounted, then dragged a filthy, frail young girl from the back of his horse. 16-year-old Matilda Lockhart had been captured 2 years earlier while working at her cousin's farm, and her return was supposed to be a cause for celebration. But when the emaciated, mutilated girl was revealed to a waiting crowd, her appearance had the opposite effect. Mary Maverick, the woman who helped nurse Matilda back to health, said that she was utterly degraded and could not hold up her head again. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores, and we were horrified to discover that her nose had been burned off. All the fleshy end was gone, and a great scab had formed, with both nostrils wide open and denuded of flesh. She told a piteous tale of how dreadfully the Indians had beaten her, and how they would wake her from her sleep by sticking a chunk of fire to her flesh, especially to her nose. Texan authorities were quick to question Matilda on the health of her fellow captives. She confirmed that at least a dozen of them were still alive, including 4 of her relatives, and claimed that various war bands would only release them if larger compensation was offered. This slightly contradicts the explanation of the Comanche peace delegates, who rightfully blamed the lack of unity among their people. Only one war band had agreed to release a prisoner, and while the others were open to negotiations, no agreement had been reached thus far. It was only then that the Comanche revealed the price for each captive's release, and it constituted a huge amount of food, medicine, ammunition, and blankets. While some argued that this was a simple miscommunication, Texan authorities viewed it as a slap in the face. In their eyes, the Comanche had brazenly defied the terms of their agreement, and they sought to detain the peace delegates until the remaining American captives were released. The Comanche were led to a one-story building next to the town's jail known as the Council House. Here, the warriors and their chieftains sat on the floor, as was their custom, while the Texans sat on chairs. A translator was then told to inform the Comanche that they were under arrest, but to the Texan's surprise, he refused. The visibly anxious translator claimed that if he did so, the Comanche would attempt to fight their way out. The Texans responded by placing several armed militia members in the room before reissuing their order to the translator. He did as they asked, then promptly fled. Upon learning that they were detained, the Comanche began to reach for their weapons. The Texan militiamen replied by leveling their shotguns and muskets while warning the warriors against belligerence, but their caution fell on deaf ears. At once, the Comanche rushed their would-be captors with knives and tomahawks drawn. The militiamen opened fire, wounding and killing several of their opening salvo, but they were quickly overwhelmed. In the blood-drenched chaos of close-quarters fighting, the Texans didn't stand a chance. Some accidentally shot each other in the confusion, while the battle-hardened Comanche warriors simply cut them to ribbons. They moved like lightning, slashing and stabbing and screeching their war cries, and within seconds, the Texans were dead. Outside the council house, the remaining Comanche heard the blood-curdling cries coming from inside and descended into a panic. Many believed that the Texans had set a trap for them and began firing arrows at just about anyone who came into view. At least one unarmed civilian was killed when an arrow cleaved its way into their skull. They died where they lay, with the smell of gun smoke in their nostrils and Comanche war cries in their ears. Once they had cleared a path of escape, the Comanche began to flee but were pursued by a number of militia reinforcements. The militiamen's fire was wild and a number of Texan civilians were killed in the crossfire. On the other hand, the Comanche's arrows were as precise as they were deadly. By the time a Comanche warrior was around 12 or 13 years old, they were such skilled archers that they were able to shoot horseflies out of the air at short ranges. What's more, a highly efficient method of shooting meant a young Comanche could fire off 3 arrows in little over 1.5 seconds. Compare that to the 30-second reload time of 19th century muskets, or the limited capacity of relatively cumbersome revolvers, which were considered to be the cutting edge of military technology. Take the example of a Texan officer by the name of Lieutenant Dunnington. At the outbreak of hostilities, Dunnington pulled his pistol and aimed it at the head of a Comanche female. She was able to shoot an arrow with such force that it passed through Dunnington's chest and buried itself into the wall behind him, all before Dunnington could even pull the trigger. The stunned officer was able to reply in turn and blew the woman's brains out before collapsing to the ground. His final words, having mistook the woman for a younger male warrior, were, "I killed him, but I believe he's killed me too." By the late afternoon, when the Comanches found themselves completely outnumbered and hopelessly surrounded, the decision was made to surrender to the Texans. 35 of their number had been killed in the fighting, while the remaining 29 were taken to the town jail as prisoners. Yet their capture had come at a heavy cost. 7 Texans had been killed outright, including a judge and the town sheriff, with dozens of others being treated for serious injuries. These injuries were treated in part by a German surgeon by the name of Dr. Weidmann, whose story is so fascinatingly horrifying that it's worthy of note. Weidmann happened to be in San Antonio on the orders of Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who had assigned him the task of studying the relatively new Republic of Texas. As thanks for his services, the San Antonio authorities offered Weidmann ample financial compensation, but he proposed a considerably more gruesome form of acquittal. Instead of money, Weidmann requested the bodies of 2 slain Comanche warriors with the intention of returning them to Europe for study. His wish was granted, and 2 days later, he boiled the bodies in a highly toxic chemical bath to strip away the flesh and organs and secure the preserved skeletons. Then, to dispose of the foul-smelling liquid remains of the 2 Comanches, Dr. Weidmann decided to pour the mess into San Antonio's only supply of drinking water, causing untold suffering to the unsuspecting townsfolk. Dr. Weidmann went from hero to villain in little over 48 hours, and once his heinous act of pollution was discovered, he was promptly chased out of town. Meanwhile, back at the town's jail, a single Comanche prisoner was released in the condition that he relay a message to the rest of his people. If all 15 American prisoners were released unharmed within 12 days, the surviving Comanche peace delegates would be allowed to live. If not, they would be executed. Exactly 1 week later, a Texan woman by the name of Mrs. Webster stumbled into San Antonio with her 3-year-old child in tow. Some reports state that Mrs. Webster had escaped from 19 months of Comanche captivity, but if she made it to San Antonio alive, it's only because her captors allowed her to. She was questioned on the fate of her fellow captives, but was unaware of their condition. Days went by, with no sign of the Comanche or their prisoners, and then finally, on the day of the deadline, another band of Comanches rode into San Antonio with 3 Texan captives in tow. One of them was a young boy named Booker, son of the previously freed Mrs. Webster. He too was asked what the condition of the remaining captives were. The story that he told was beyond horrifying. When word of the council house shootout reached the Comanches, they were enraged. The wives of the slain warriors demanded vengeance, and when it was granted to them, the methods of torture they conjured up were the stuff of nightmares. One Texan captive was slowly roasted to death over an open fire. Another was slowly dismembered, with the Comanches cauterizing the amputations to prevent blood loss and prolong their victims' suffering. Booker Webster had also heard of another captive Texan who was beaten, bound, then laid next to an anthill. The Comanche then sliced off the prisoner's eyelids and then watched as the ants devoured the soft tissue of their unprotected eyeballs. Other methods of torture employed by the Comanche involved the use of hot coals. Victims sometimes had white-hot pieces of firewood stuffed into their mouths or were tied down before it was heaped on top of their stomachs and genitals. As you can imagine, the news horrified the Texans, who flat-out refused to release their own Comanche prisoners. They were later moved from the city jail to a U.S. Army encampment at the head of the San Antonio River, but escaped in dribs and drabs over the years that followed. In the aftermath of the council house shootout and their chief's permanent detention by Texan officials, the Comanche hungered for revenge. The war chief of the Pentecost War Band, a man named Buffalo Hump, began riding between neighboring Comanche groups to converse with their warriors. At each stop, he made the case for a unified act of vengeance, a single brutal riposte that would avenge their fallen and captured brethren. Over the course of that summer, the young war chief gathered up a raiding party of between 400 and 500 Comanche warriors, and they began raiding the smaller settlements between Austin and San Antonio. With each raid, the war party grew stronger and stronger, until finally they were ready for much larger game. And on August 6th of 1840, citizens of the fledgling settlements of Victoria awoke to a harrowing sight. Almost 600 heavily armed Comanche warriors, resplendent in their martial finery, whooped their war cries as they galloped towards Victoria. They'd been caught completely unprepared, and they paid for their lack of diligence and blood. The Comanches swept through the town, slaughtering as they went, and when the opportunity presented itself, they scalped their fallen victims with glee. The quick and the fortunate were able to barricade themselves inside homes and businesses, while those with rifles took pot shots at the Comanche from windows and balconies. The warriors killed around 24 civilians, looted numerous stores and warehouses, then vanished almost as quickly as they'd appeared. 2 days later, the Comanches arrived at the small port of Linville, northeast of modern-day Port Lavaca. Thanks to the advance warning from Victoria, the vast majority of Linville's citizens were able to escape unharmed. They simply boarded the boats docked in the town's harbor and sailed out to a distance the Comanche were unwilling to pursue them. Yet, this meant that they were forced to watch as their homes were smashed, soiled, and looted by vengeful warriors who carted off the modern-day equivalent of $9 million worth of goods. Over the course of the next few hours, the jubilant warriors relished their moment of victory. They dressed themselves in a colorful cavalcade of Texan clothes, drank themselves legless on looted hooch, and took a horrifying amount of pleasure in torturing their captives to death. Only 6 of Victoria's citizens had been unable to escape in time, one of whom was a man named Hugh Orrin Watts, who had delayed his escape to retrieve a family heirloom. Hugh probably heard stories of the Comanche's brutality, yet it's likely he didn't know exactly what that entailed. But thanks to a serious error of judgment, he received a full and comprehensive education of what it meant to be a Comanche prisoner. It was a standard practice for Comanche warriors, as well as other Great Plains tribes, to inflict unspeakable horrors on those they defeated in battle. But this was not a moral decision, and those who employed such barbarity cannot truly be described as evil. You see, in a society where courage was prized above all, being tortured to death offered a warrior the opportunity to prove himself worthy of the title. To die with fortitude was a thing of great honor, and since he would be shown no mercy, he would show none in return. It's not clear how Hugh Watts died on the day of the Linville raid, but it's safe to say that it would have been agonizingly slow and unimaginably painful. At the time, Linville was the second largest port in Texas, and capturing such a large town was a monumentous occasion for many of the Comanche warriors. Yet opting to savor the moment proved to be their downfall. One of the great military strengths of all Native American tribes was their incredible mobility, and the success of a raid rested not just on the speed and surprise of the attack, but also the urgency of the withdrawal. In sacking and burning Linville, the Comanche had given the pursuing Texas Rangers enough time to coordinate their forces and plan an attack. Volunteer companies from all over East and Central Texas converged on Linville, and they eventually tracked the fleeing Comanches to a place called Plum Creek, not far from modern-day Lockhart. Around 60 Comanche warriors were killed in the first few minutes of the Rangers' ambush, and the remainder were forced to flee with only what they could carry. There's no doubt that, thanks to the element of surprise, the pursuing Rangers could have run the bloodied warband down and slaughtered them, but as they rode through the Comanche campground, they made a startling discovery. Thousands of dollars in silver bullion was discovered in the packs of several mules. The Rangers were faced with a choice: do their job or succumb to their greed, and they chose the latter. Whether or not this was a deliberate ploy for the ever-cunning Comanche, it's not for me to say, but the fact remains, the Rangers' greed was the warband's salvation and thus marked the end of the Great Comanche Raid of 1840. The cycle of violence would continue for decades afterwards, with hideous injustices, betrayals, and atrocities committed by both sides. The morality of westward expansion and the philosophy of manifest destiny will be debated and scrutinized until there's no one left to talk about them. But when talk stops, and the sun sets over the land that's yours and mine, we can take comfort in the relative peace and security that most of us enjoy today, because coexistence is always preferable to killing. My name is Ryan. I'm from southern Oklahoma, and I'm half Native American on my mom's side. My grandpa, who was born in the year 1912, was full-blooded Comanche, and much like a lot of the elders from around his time, he had a lot of stories to tell. These weren't his own stories, and they were passed down from his grandfather in turn, and they're from a time before the Wild West was tamed, as they say. He used to tell us some pretty wild tales sometimes, of how our ancestors would talk to spirits using peyote cactus, or how they could shoot nickels out of the air with their bows and arrows. Most of Grandpa's stories were either interesting or insightful like that, but every so often, he'd tell us something a little darker. Now, I'm no expert in Native American history or culture, so I'm not going to pretend to be able to speak for other tribes, but I know that a lot of tribes were mostly peaceful hunter and gatherers who only went to war to defend themselves and their land. The Comanche were not one of those tribes. Basically, a bunch of other tribes forced the Comanche out of Wyoming and south into the Great Plains of Texas and Oklahoma. This is because we sucked at everything. We couldn't fight, we couldn't farm, and when we got to the plains, life sucked even harder, because the whole place is basically one big grassy desert. But then, the Comanches got horses from the Spanish, and because we didn't have much else going for us, we decided to get really good at riding horses. This gave us a huge advantage over, well, just about everyone, and because we had a huge chip on our shoulder, we decided to get a little payback on all the other tribes. We beat the Apache, who'd been bugging us ever since we arrived on the plains, all the way down into Mexico and Nevada. I mean, we were kicking it hard and taking names all the way from Kansas to Corpus Christi, but that's about where I stopped being proud of it. I know it's an overdone bit to be like, war isn't glamorous, y'all, but in the case of the tribes of the Great Plains, it's a gigantic understatement. Yes, we stuck it to the settler colonizers for like 100 years, but we did it in some pretty disgusting ways. Nowadays, wars have rules, but back then, it was anything goes, and that whole scalping thing really is just the tip of a very gory iceberg. Kids were routinely killed, women were made into slave wives, whole families were tortured until they just straight up died. The settlers did some evil stuff to us too, but it's like the Comanche made war crimes into an art form. But that's just the way things were back then. Like I said, anything goes. All that nasty stuff said was, hey, don't mess with us or you'll get this too. But still, it makes me glad that I was a 70s kid and not an 1870s kid, you know? Anyway, like I said earlier, every so often Grandpa would break out a horror story for just us boys. It makes me cringe a little to think about it now, but back then, those were my favorite kinds of stories to hear from him. Call it that morbid curiosity that all teenage boys have, but I was really into hearing about our people's badass past, and if I thought that it was an appropriate moment, I'd bug him until he told me one. He told me a few humdingers over the years, let me tell you, but the one he saved for Halloween when we were all hitting our mid-teens had the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. So, picture the scene. It's like the 1850s or whatever, and the war between my ancestors and the white settlers is at its peak. We'd raid some homestead, steal a bunch of horses, and then ride off onto the plains to make our escape. Inevitably, we'd end up getting followed by a bunch of soldiers or Texas Rangers who planned on getting revenge and taking back the horses. Now on paper, getting chased like that isn't ideal, but the reality is, us Comanches enjoyed it when the Texans followed us out into the plains. See, we traveled much lighter, and had our pick of the best horses, so we'd always end up escaping. Then as the raiders wandered around the plains running out of food and water, we'd just hide out somewhere and watch them. After a few days, the rangers would be really low on supplies, and you gotta remember, these dudes would ride for days at a time trying to catch us. They weren't just in and out real quick, 20-minute adventures, as they say. They rode for hundreds of miles at a time. But then, on their final night's camp before heading back to civilization, Comanche warriors would sneak up to their horses in the middle of the night and stampede them off into the plains before the rangers knew what hit them. A really skilled group of warriors would stampede the horses through the rangers' camp, wounding and killing a few of them while robbing them of their transport in the process. The result would be a few dozen stranded rangers facing a 7-day walk with no food or water if they ever wanted to see home again. And by the sounds of things, not many of them did. Grandpa said that a lot of the time the Comanche wouldn't even waste bullets or arrows on the stranded rangers. They just watched them on horseback from a distance, taunting and laughing at them. Some men collapsed from heat stroke and died where they fell. Their comrades were forced to keep going, probably looking back in time to see their friends being scalped and butchered. I can't even imagine how horrifying it must have been to see that, and to wonder how long it'd be before it was your turn to die. Dehydration killed the next bunch, and when the group of rangers was in a weak enough state, the Comanches flew in, finished them off, and then went off looking for their horses to add to their collections. But every so often some ranger or soldier proved much tougher than the others, and could be seen wandering back home alone long after their fellow rangers had died or deserted them. These were the guys who actually earned a little respect from the Comanche, but unfortunately, not their mercy. In fact, it became a kind of a game to mess with the final survivor. The Comanche would do things like pour water on the ground about 100 meters ahead of them, and then watched as they rushed to suck up the mud it produced. They'd do other stuff like ride up real fast and then lean over to one side, and then slap the lone survivor around the head before laughing. I asked Grandpa why the ranger didn't shoot him, but he explained that they'd be too weak to hold their rifles by that point. All they had left were swinging a knife or hatchet all pathetically while the Comanche screwed with them. The point is, it became a game to do stuff like that, and more often than not, the Comanche ended up killing this lone survivor, stripping their corpses, and then riding off to do it all over again once they were good and ready. Anyway, in this one story, my Comanche ancestors are trailing this lone surviving Texas Ranger, waiting for him to drop his rifle so they can swoop in to start messing with him. He'd been going on no food or water for a long time, kind of going along through the grass into the featureless horizon, longer than the warriors had ever seen any lone survivor go before him. And then finally, he spins around, takes a wildly inaccurate shot at the Comanche's direction. The bullet whizzes harmlessly past them, and the Comanches start laughing and taunting the ranger. But then, the ranger starts laughing back at them. Confused, the warriors ride in closer, then draw down with their lances on him. Most other in his place would have tried to run or fight. Heck, some even took their own lives to save them from what they knew was coming. But instead of doing any of that, the ranger tears open his shirt, points to his heart, and with a big smile on his face, starts goading them to kill him and get it over with. The Comanche didn't understand what he was saying, but with a gesture like that, it didn't need any translating. The Comanches looked at each other, impressed by the man's bravery in the face of death. But as they did so, the man shoved aside their lances and carried on his march along the plains. Obviously, the Comanche followed the man on their horses, watching in bemusement as he continued laughing and joking with himself. To try and find out if the man was brave or if he'd simply lost his mind, one of the Comanche leaned in with their lance and stabbed the man in the arm deep enough to draw a heavy amount of blood. The man didn't cry out in pain. Instead, his laughter intensified. He then tore off his shirt and began cupping his hand under the wound, letting his own blood pool in his palm before he gulped it down in a mad, desperate thirst. Now to us, this is a clear sign as any that the guy had completely lost his mind. But drinking blood wasn't nearly as extreme to the Comanche as it is to us. If they were in a bad spot and couldn't find any drinking water, it wasn't uncommon for the Comanche to drink a little tortoise or jackrabbit blood to prevent them from keeling over. So to them, having this guy drink his own blood wasn't a deciding factor in if he was crazy or not. I can already hear most of you asking, why does this guy's mental health have anything to do with how the Comanche are going to treat him? Well, if a person was really brave, then it was an honor to kill them and take their scalp. But if they were crazy, the Comanches believed that they had bad magic about them. It was no honor to kill someone barely capable of defending themselves, and whatever badness was in their victim, it might jump to them, to put it simply. The Comanche didn't have any set religion or anything like that. They had their customs and traditions, but spirituality tended to be a person-to-person thing. Some warriors prayed to lucky trinkets for protection, others worshipped pet crows, but everyone agreed that there was a kind of magic in the world. Sometimes that magic worked for good, sometimes for bad. So still unsure that the lone survivor was mad or not, one of the Comanche rode forward, intent on taking a trophy. He scalped the survivor, standing up, slicing around the base of his skull before pulling away at the bloody mess of hair and flesh. Again, the man just laughed louder and harder when another might have just howled in agony. And once the warrior was done, the lone survivor turned around, saw his own bloody scalp flapping in the wind, and began to clap. As you can imagine, it took a lot to freak out a hardened Comanche warrior, but the display the scalped and bloodied survivor was putting on was unlike anything they'd ever seen. It took a minute or two before they figured out what they wanted to do with him, but in the end, they decided that they had to break him. This guy was human, and a weak European one, they thought too. He might have been acting strong like a Comanche, but they were going to prove that he wasn't all that. They jumped off their horses, knocked the guy to the ground, then tied him up and staked him down. The Comanches then got a small fire burning, stripped the dude naked, and then lay him near the fire, legs spread, with the fire near his you-know-whats. The plan was to drag him closer and closer to the fire, legs wide open until his junk was burned to a crisp, and even the most incredibly courageous of warriors broke at the threat of that. But once again, the shirtless, blood-soaked, scalpless survivor just laughed, and this time, he starts nodding his head as if to say, "Do it, do it." And this was the last straw for the Comanches. If this guy didn't care about his junk getting roasted, if he actually wanted it, then there had to be something deeply wrong with him, and the Comanches took that as some very bad magic. Kill a person with that kind of magic in them and the effect could be deadly, not just for the warrior who did the deed, but their entire extended family too. With that being the case, The warriors just left him there and then rode off before the guy's bad magic could follow him. The last they saw of the guy, this guy was walking back home, naked as the day he was born, scalpless and covered in blood. And for around a quarter mile they could still hear him laughing to himself. Of all the stories my grandpa told me, that's the one that creeps me out the most, because it's not really about evil spirits or demons or any of the messed up things the Comanches or the Texan Rangers did. It's about how war can make a man lose his mind to the point he's not even really a person anymore. It's like he went out, thinking that he was fighting monsters, and then became one along the way. On October 28th of 1827, in Crawford County, Illinois, a woman by the name of Lucinda Parker gave birth to a baby girl she named Cynthia Ann. If she'd remained in the state of Illinois, little Cynthia might have led an unremarkable life, but around the age of 9 or 10 years old, her parents made a monumental decision. They agreed to follow their extended family into the heart of Mexican-ruled Texas, to a place now known as Limestone County. There, the Parker family constructed a heavily fortified compound consisting of several block houses surrounding a central defensive citadel. It was christened Fort Parker, and within just a few short weeks, the entire Parker clan had been joined by a bevy of other Anglo-American settlers who dreamed of peace, piety, and prosperity. By the spring of 1836, the Parkers had tilled half a dozen plots of land and were busying themselves in preparation to farm it. The work was endless, the heat oppressive, and the land near barren, but for a time, the Parkers were happy, healthy, and free. Until one day, when a man collecting firewood began to feel like he was being watched. Over the weeks that followed, more and more of the family began to complain of that same creeping feeling, as if the nearby woods were haunted by unseen apparitions. In response, Fort Parker's security contingent was doubled, with at least 2 men watching the walls at any one time. Then finally, at the break of dawn on May 19th of 1836, one of the watchmen began to raise the alarm. The terror in the young man's voice was heard by each and every one of Fort Parker's inhabitants, and as armed settlers scrambled to man the fort's crude battlements, they immediately understood his fears. A huge war party of Comanche and Kiowa warriors was galloping across the plains towards the fort, but just before passing into range of the settlers' muskets, the party halted and began waving a huge white flag. The settlers held their fire, hoping that the warriors had simply come to talk or trade. John Parker knew otherwise. The Comanche and their Kiowa allies had quickly worked out that a large piece of white cloth had some kind of magical effect on the Anglo-American settlers. Upon waving one in their direction, a heavily armed, well-defended group would sometimes completely let down their guard, making them ripe for the slaughter. It only took 1 or 2 instances of this feigned surrender tactic before outrage swept across the prairie, and John Parker knew all too well that it was a trap. Cynthia Ann's father, Silas, proposed that the settlers strike first, claiming that 5 good men would be enough to defend the fort if properly supplied and positioned. His brother Benjamin disagreed. The 48-year-old knew how skilled the Comanche were at scaling enemy fortifications and argued the defenders would last just minutes before being overrun. According to Benjamin, the best that they could hope for was to play dumb, attempt to negotiate, and buy the women and children enough time to mount an escape attempt when the assault finally came. And at that, he volunteered himself to be the doomed emissary. As the Parkers watched an unarmed Benjamin walk out of the fort and towards the mounted Comanche, they knew it was the last time they'd ever see him alive. Yet they honored his last request, gathered up a few essentials, and prepared to flee into the nearby woods. Silas took charge of the defenders, instructing them to open fire as soon as Benjamin had been killed. They fought like lions, and a handful of Comanche were killed by their musket fire, but they were drops in a torrent of violence that spilled over Fort Parker with a terrifying speed. Their final stand bought their families a few minutes, but for some, it wasn't enough. Samuel Frost and his young son were cornered by the Comanche as they attempted to flee. Frost was forced to watch the scalping and execution of his young son before he too was mutilated and murdered. John Parker's wife was almost out of the fort when she turned around for one final goodbye. Instead, she witnessed a trio of Comanche warriors castrating her husband while he wailed in agony. The sight was too much for her to bear. She collapsed to her knees, broken and sobbing, and was captured by the Comanche. Cynthia's mother and her two youngest siblings slipped away with the help of an armed teenage boy. Cynthia herself was not so lucky. She was quickly surrounded by Comanche warriors, picked up, and then thrown onto one of the horses. Then, after looting and burning the fort, the warriors departed. While it's indisputably unfortunate that Cynthia was captured, her age meant that she fared far better than most Comanche prisoners. In the aftermath of a Comanche raid, grown men were invariably tortured, killed, and then scalped. Older women were violated by groups of warriors, then tortured and executed in similar ways to the menfolk, while younger women were sometimes taken as slaves. Babies and small children were also killed, but when it comes to children between the ages of 9 to 13, the Comanches made an exception. Kids of that age were ripe to be integrated into the tribe, first as slave labor, but eventually a fully fledged member of the tribe if they proved themselves worthy. Cynthia, being around 9 or 10 years old at the time of her abduction, had been picked out by the warriors for this exact purpose, and although her life among her family's killers was initially traumatic, her resilience marked her out as having massive amounts of potential. As I've mentioned, Cynthia's first few months as a Comanche prisoner were extremely rough. If her experience was anything like other captives of that period, she was most likely treated with extreme contempt by the other females of the tribe, while being used as a source of menial slave labor. But after learning the Comanche language and standing up for herself on a few occasions, she gained the respect of her peers and began to slowly increase in standing. She was given more and more freedom to do as she pleased, so long as she partook in some of the more arduous camp tasks. She was taught to tan the hides of slaughtered buffalo, a gruesome process that involved painting the raw skin of the buffalo with its own brains. She learned quickly, and her output soon rivaled those of even the most experienced Comanche tanners. Depending on the source, she was given the name Narua, meaning that which has been found, and within just a few short years, Cynthia Ann was not only given free rein of the camp, but a great deal of responsibility. Comanche bands would typically migrate approximately every 2 weeks, and the women were responsible for all aspects of the move, Cynthia included. The fact that she was given responsibility over the other people's belongings speaks volumes to the trust and respect the Comanche bestowed upon her, and she was soon partaking in all parts of Comanche womanhood. All except one. It's believed that around the age of 13 or 14, Cynthia was introduced to a warrior who went by the name of Peta Nokona. The pair became fast friends, and after Peta was promoted to war chief, he proposed to her. Although it was traditional for chieftains to have several wives, Peta refrained from taking another wife, and the couple were said to be deeply in love and very happy together. They would go on to have 3 children together, a boy named Pecos, a daughter named Prairie Flower, and a second son who Cynthia named Quana. To Cynthia's knowledge, they were her only living family, and she was every part the loving Comanche mother to them. But Cynthia was also mistaken. Several members of the Parker family had miraculously survived the massacre at Fort Parker, and once they were back on their feet, they set about searching for their missing relatives. Decades passed, and time after time they were told that Cynthia was most likely deceased. But the Parkers were also acutely aware of the Comanches' habit of integrating children into their war bands, and they never gave up on looking. Finally, in December of 1860, more than 26 years after the raid on Fort Parker, a group of Texas Rangers tracked a band of Comanche warriors back to their camp, a camp that was rumored to hold live Anglo-American captives. As dawn broke on December 18th, Ranger Captain Saul Ross sent a detachment of 20 men to position themselves behind a chain of sandhills overlooking the camp, the goal being to cut off any potential escape route. The remaining 40 Rangers then crept up the crest of an adjacent hill, then attacked the completely unprepared Comanche in unison. It was an incredible achievement. It wasn't often that a people so tactically masterful as the Comanche were caught unaware, and the result was nothing short of devastating. The entire war band were either killed by the attacking Rangers or picked off by the blocking force atop the sandy hills. At one point, a Texas Ranger found himself face to face with a terrified Comanche woman. He aimed his revolver at her and prepared to defend himself, but hesitated when he noticed that the woman held a baby in her arms. Having decided to take the woman prisoner, the Ranger began barking rudimentary orders at her, gesturing wildly for her to sit down. But as he did so, he noticed that unlike her fellow Comanche, this woman had pale blue eyes and a lighter, sandier brown hair. The Ranger asked the terrified mother in clear, plain English, "Who are you?" And in reply she said, "Me Cincy Ann." By 1860, the story of the massacre at Fort Parker had gained international infamy. The Texas government had named a county after the family, with Cynthia Ann being a household name in all four corners of the state. The ranger who found her must have immediately recognized who was sat in front of him and marked it one of the most monumentous recoveries in ranger history. Captain Ross rushed Cynthia back to nearby Fort Belknap, then summoned her Uncle Isaac to deliver the good news. At first he didn't recognize her, but the family resemblance slowly became evident, and Isaac was stunned to realize that the girl was his long-lost niece. To say that Cynthia's entire world had fallen apart would be a huge understatement, and it wasn't the second time she had endured such a calamitous event. She wasn't exactly thrilled to have returned to so-called civilization, but she also acknowledged Isaac as a relative and agreed to return to Isaac's home in Weatherford. Shortly afterward, the state of Texas compensated Cynthia by granting her 5,000 acres of land and an annual pension of $100 for the next 5 years. They appointed her Uncle Isaac as her legal guardian, wishing her a long and happy life, then left her to decompress. By all accounts, Cynthia tried her best to reintegrate back into Anglo-American society, but adjusting to such a radical culture shift proved a feat too difficult to accomplish a second time. Her Uncle Isaac would sometimes catch her performing intricate rituals involving fire and tobacco smoke, and he once asked her the purpose of such things. In broken English, she told him that they were prayers for the husband and children she'd lost, and prayers that she could finally be happy with her blood relatives. At one point, a man fluent in the Comanche language came to visit Cynthia in the hopes of learning more about her time living with the tribe. Initially, Cynthia stared daggers at him, having long grown tired of being gawped at by curious white men. But when he spoke to her in Comanche and invited her to talk, she quite literally threw herself at the man's feet, and in a voice that trembled with tears held back, she replied, "Yes, let us talk." For Cynthia Ann, her time with the linguist was perhaps the happiest in recent memory. She shared a great deal with the man, not because she enjoyed his company, but because she could finally communicate herself properly. When they tried to have dinner, Cynthia playfully chastised the man, stealing away his cutlery as she told him, "We can eat later, but now we talk." Perhaps there was a slim chance for Cynthia, but it died along with her daughter, Prairie Flower, who succumbed to influenza in 1864. The grief of losing her final child drove her over the edge, and she began to engage in a series of grisly Comanche grief rituals. She would slash at her breast with a razor-sharp knife, dribble the blood onto some tobacco, and then inhale the smoke it produced when put to flame. And she did this for hours on end, on a daily basis, until she finally made the decision to stop eating. After wasting away for the better part of a month, 43-year-old Cynthia Ann Parker passed away in March of 1871 and was buried in Foster Cemetery near the small town of Poynter, Texas. Cynthia Ann's story, as well as that of the wider Parker family, is perhaps one of the most horrifying, heartbreaking, and underexplored in all American history. But not all of their lives had had such tragic endings, and as an epilogue, I'd like to touch on the life of Cynthia's younger brother and fellow Comanche captive, John Richard Parker. Much like his sister, John was raised as a Comanche, but his upbringing was radically different to that of Cynthia Ann. Comanche boys between the ages of around 9 to 14 led lives that would inspire envy in their modern-day counterparts. They had absolutely no responsibilities, no chores, no formal education. They just played around with their bows and blunt arrows, rode around on horseback, and generally did as they pleased. They did this day in and day out for years, and by the time they were young men, they were phenomenal archers and master horsemen. John spent 6 years with the Comanche from the ages of 6 to 12 years old, but was ransomed back to Texan authorities in 1842. In contrast to his sister, 12-year-old John made an attempt to reintegrate himself back into Anglo-American society and soon ran away to rejoin his Comanche war band. The Comanche were no doubt delighted with his decision, and even the most skeptical of warriors would have been impressed. The boy had deserted his own blood relatives to rejoin the war band, a demonstration of loyalty tantamount to an oath of allegiance. John would have no doubt spent the next few years preparing to become a fully fledged Comanche raider, and by the time he was 18, he was participating in devastating raids deep in the heart of Mexican territory. This means John would have participated in all the torture, murder, and violation that came with successful raids, and by the time he was a veteran warrior in his mid-20s, it's likely he'd killed hundreds of soldiers, civilians, and rival Apache. Yet it was on one of these raids that John almost met his end, not by the tip of some Apache arrow or Mexican bullet, by an invisible killer, responsible for more death than any weapon of war. After one particular profitable raid, John's war band were on their way back to Texas when he began to feel ill. Before long, he was too sick to ride, and with a rudimentary medical exam, his fellow warriors discovered that he was suffering from smallpox. The Comanche were well aware of how devastating the disease was, and John understood that he had to be abandoned in order to protect his brethren. It's likely he accepted this fate with a quiet stoicism, as would be expected of him as a warrior, but to alleviate his suffering, his Comanche comrades ordered a captured Mexican slave girl to stay with him until his death. Miraculously, not only did John survive his bout of smallpox, but his impromptu caregiver failed to contract it in turn. As she nursed him back to health, the pair fell deeply in love, and after returning the girl to her family, John proposed, and they were married. Incredibly, John would later return to the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War. His motivations for doing so are unclear, as he most likely felt no loyalties to his former home, but he soon signed up with a group of Texan Confederates and rode north to battle the Union. He most probably served with groups of so-called bushwhackers, mounted guerrilla united, which conducted lightning-fast raids against Union positions before disappearing again in a cloud of dust and gun smoke. Their tactics would have suited his unique Comanche skill set, and his commanders no doubt used him to devastating effect. Shockingly, John survived the Civil War and returned to his home in Mexico following the collapse of the Confederacy. The loot he came home with made him a very wealthy man, and he was able to purchase his own ranch on which to raise a family. He lived to the ripe old age of 85 and died peacefully of natural causes sometime in 1915. John's life and death provided a remarkable silver lining to the violence and grief of the raid on Fort Parker. He is once living proof that the Comanches were not monsters, merely a nomadic, primordial civilization shaped by centuries of deprivation, forced migration, and inter-tribal warfare. Rachel Parker Plummer was born on March 22nd of 1819 in Crawford County, Illinois. She was the second cousin of Cynthia Ann Parker and joined the rest of the Parker clan in their migration south to Texas before being captured in the raid that forever changed her family. She was described as a red-haired beauty of rare courage and intelligence, and later married a man named Luther M. Plummer, who somehow survived the raid that saw his wife taken into captivity. In the chaotic aftermath of the attack on Fort Parker, 17-year-old Rachel was seized by mounted warriors who also captured her young son. She was no doubt violated during that night's camp, but later wrote that she never wished to revisit the subject in any of her literature. To narrate their barbarous treatment would only add to my present distress, she wrote, for it is with feelings of the deepest mortification that I think of it, much less to speak or write of it. The only other occasion on which she spoke of her violation was to criticize those who claimed that, and I quote, A good woman died before being sullied in such a way. Rachel said that anyone who said that had clearly not been forced to run naked, tied by a rope to a horse, for a day or two in the sun. Given that she had more advanced education than her younger cousins, Rachel was able to write a detailed account of her time in captivity, and it serves as a valuable insight into the culture and creed of the Comanche people. Yet it also serves as a detailed account of their abject and unfeeling cruelty, especially when it came to things that might hinder their survival. During her captivity, Rachel gave birth to a healthy baby boy. For the first 6 weeks, the Comanche allowed Rachel to nurse her newborn son, but then one day, a group of warriors surrounded her and stole her child from her arms. One of the warriors threw the baby to the ground and beat it till it stopped moving. The warriors then gestured for Rachel to bury her now deceased child and then walked away. Believing her son was dead, Rachel began scrapping a swallow trench in the dry earth beneath her. But as she did so, she noticed her little boy was still breathing. She attempted to nurse him back to health, but when the warriors heard the baby's cries and saw that Rachel had disobeyed them, they chose to make an example. Rachel's infant child was tied to a hose via a long rope and then dragged through a cactus patch until its tiny body had been quite literally torn to shreds. Rachel was then taken hundreds of miles north to the furthest reaches of the Comanche homeland. There she saw vast, wide-open spaces so desolate and barren that they were almost maddening to behold. But after reaching the southern reaches of what is now southern Colorado, the land became lush and abundant with life. The warband that she was a prisoner of took her along to a giant Comanche summit, one which included their close allies, the Kiowa. She wrote that she had never seen so many people in one place before, nor imagined that there would be so many Indians scattered across the Great Plains. She was treated poorly at the gathering, and was often jeered at by young Comanche boys. She also spotted many other Anglo and Hispanic American captives among the war bands, and such a large gathering provided a clear opportunity to show them off. Having picked up some of the Comanche language, Rachel was able to eavesdrop on certain conversations and amazed to hear that their war chiefs intended to conquer the entirety of Central America. Rachel's maltreatment at the hands of her captives seemed to have peaked around the time of the Great Comanche Summit. She was guarded by the female members of the tribe, and as you can imagine, they came up with particularly cruel and degrading methods of humiliation. They routinely beat and tormented her, and by the time they departed from the summit, Rachel was bruised, battered, and itching for retribution. One day, during a period of particularly intense abuse, Rachel snapped and launched herself at the younger of her 2 slave masters. The attack was half revenge, half attempting to take her own life, but instead of killing her, the warriors seemed impressed with Rachel's display of defiance. At any second, I expected a spear in the back, she wrote, but instead, the warriors seemed amused and gathered to watch us fight. At one point, Rachel managed to gain the upper hand and proceeded to beat the young Comanche woman until the blood ran from her mouth and nose. Her older slave master soon intervened and attempted to set Rachel alight by pushing her into an open fire. She too was beaten half to death by the furious young captive, who bested both her mistresses in brutal fashion, yet refrained from delivering fatal blows. When the violence was over, Rachel and her Comanche owners were taken before a tribunal of elders. Rachel thoroughly expected to be executed for her insolence, but instead, all the elders asked was that she repair the damage that she'd inflicted to her owner's teepee. Bemused but continually defiant, Rachel said that she'd only repair the damage if her owners helped her, and the elders agreed. She later claimed that one of the elders told her, "She began with you, and you had a right to kill her, but your noble spirit prevented you. Indians do not have pity on a fallen enemy, but we show mercy to our family." By brutally attacking the 2 young women assigned to guard her, Rachel had not in fact angered the Comanche. She had earned their respect, and from then on, their treatment of her dramatically improved. Just over a year after she was captured on June 19th of 1837, the Comanche war band Rachel traveled with was approached by a group of Mexican merchants. Known as Comancheros, those roving traders knew the Great Plains better than any Anglo-American and were one of the few groups to ever gain a free pass through the land they called Comanche. The traders approached the warband, and the Comanches sent out a small welcome party to begin negotiations. Rachel watched the exchange, wondering what goods or services might be traded. Little did she know, she was who the Comancheros were looking for. Rachel's father, who had survived the massacre at Fort Parker, had enlisted the help of the Comancheros in tracking down his daughter, and finally, they had found her. That morning, Rachel didn't know if she'd live to see another sunrise. A few hours later, she was free. 17 days later, Rachel and the Comancheros arrived back in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She was gaunt to the point of near starvation, covered with scars and sores, and her fiery red hair had turned a silvery gray. But she was alive. Sadly, Rachel Parker Plummer passed away just over a year later in Houston, Texas, on March 19th of 1839. She was just 20 years old. Her death certificate stated that complications after childbirth were to blame for her demise, but her husband insisted it was the trauma of Comanche captivity which slowly ate away at her. In reality, the already weakened Rachel had been suffering awfully during the unseasonable cold weather, and this was most likely what finished her off. But the fact remains, a once vibrant, outgoing young woman had been completely broken by her time in captivity. And although she'd seen and done more in her brief time on this earth than most folks do in a lifetime, there's no doubt that she deserved so much more. We have an old legend in our family. I don't know how true it is, but I guess that's why they call it a legend. It's been passed down for generation to generation. I know that much, as my great-aunt remembered my great-grandpa telling the story, too, so I don't think it's something my grandpa just pulled out of his butt after a night of gin and Clint Eastwood movies. The story goes that some distance back, we have a Native American ancestor who was part of the Tonkawa tribe. They're located around Texas and Oklahoma, maybe New Mexico too. But when Forefather was just a child, something terrible happened that caused him to leave his home and move up to Chicago. There he met our distant foremother, and the rest is literally history. But the thing that caused him to up and move is one of the most awful things I've ever heard. So, just a little backstory. The Tonkawa were a tribe that was mostly friendly with the United States and all its westward settlers. The other, more dominant tribe in the area, the Comanche and the Apache, used to bully the hell out of the Tonkawa on any chance they got, so they turned to the U.S. Army for protection and occasionally helped them track down Comanche as a kind of screw you to their old enemies. Then some other guys who liked to hunt Comanche were called scalp hunters. These were mercenaries that would go and kill a bunch of Comanches and then bring back their scalps to big towns to swap them for cash. These guys would sometimes search out Tonkawa camps as places to rest and trade, so unlike some other more famous tribes, the Tonkawa were generally pretty stoked to see foreigners on the horizon, even if they did look like they were armed for bear. So one day, a whole load of these hairy, stinky-looking dudes show up at our forefathers' camp and then start making themselves a little too comfortable. They're eating the Tonkawa food, helping themselves to tobacco, and it's not long before they outstayed their welcome. Eventually, one of the warriors approaches them and tells them to leave. The scalp hunters just opened up on him before anyone had a chance to defend themselves. Everything becomes chaos, and our forefather runs for his life and then hides out on the prairie for a while until things blow over. Sometimes you could actually hear the scalp hunters searching for him, but he stayed hidden until it was safe to come out. Hours later, our forefather trekked back to this village under the cover of darkness. It was easy to find. He could see it burning in the distance. He rushed over to search for any survivors, but what he saw was a vision of hell itself, he described. Among the burning teepees lay the bodies of almost everyone he'd ever known, and they were butchered in ways that gave him nightmares for the rest of his life. He never spoke about it in detail, but I could imagine the kinds of things he saw. The story goes that these particular scalp hunters were running a murderous kind of scam. They were being paid for Comanche scalps, but no one could tell the difference between a Comanche scalp and that of any other Indian. No white man could tell the difference between an Indian scalp and a Mexican, for that matter, so These guys were just on a murderous rampage all over the borderlands, killing whenever and whoever they pleased. Our ancestor had his whole entire life burned in a few hours, leaving him with nothing and no one. The story goes that he walked all the way to El Paso and almost died on the journey. He was so dehydrated and hungry that at one point he sees this buffalo keel over in the distance. He then rushes over, tears the thing's stomach open with his teeth, and then starts eating the half-digested mush in the buffalo's stomach. I honestly think I'd rather die than do something like that, but I guess I've never been that hungry or thirsty before. He made it to El Paso, ended up surviving and working there until he had enough money to move north, and then move he did. It seems crazy that he managed to pull something like that off. Some orphaned Indian kid all on his own like that in a place they weren't very popular. Makes sense that he moved north as soon as he could. I'm not one of those people who flaunts my native heritage when it's so distant and obscure to me, but I'm very proud of my forefather, especially if he managed to pull off such an incredible feat of survival. Maybe I got a little of that in me too. Well, here's hoping, anyway. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, never call a plumber when there's a full moon.